All right, we're going to go ahead and get started, and thank you for joining our 5th week of the Winter Nature Challenge. And again, this is in place of our Water Watch lecture series, and it's been a lot of fun. We're almost halfway through. Today we have Brian and we have Morgan and myself. And I just want to say a shout out to Clean Harbors for being our lead sponsor, in addition to the Massachusetts Cultural Council. And we have just started getting results from the local cultural councils. And I just want to do a shout out to Marshfield Cultural Council. They're the first that we've heard back from in sponsoring this event. So we're really excited, and we know there are more to come. So thank you to the MCC. We really appreciate the support for this great program. I just want to mention the South Shore Natural Science Nature Center Preschool is doing a great program this Saturday called Pinch Pots and Parenthood. And it is geared toward families. And it's going to be presented by Jonathan James Perry and Leah Hopkins. And Jonathan is actually joining us tonight. So we're excited to have him tonight and then to see them again on Saturday. And if you'd like to register, you can do so via our website at ssnsc.org. And then from here, I'm going to turn it over to Morgan.
Thank you. Yes. So representing Mass Audubon here, really excited for this evening's presentation, and have seen, been able to, I've actually not been able to attend all of these, but I've watched all of them. So go check out the recordings of the other ones if this is your first time here with us. A program that we have coming up also virtually this Friday is Dottie Metcalf Lindenberger is going to be speaking about her adventure on the International Space Station. So an astronaut, geologist, mother, and a woman who's actually, hiked 100 miles around Mount Rainier. So a really fascinating life that she's going to share with us. And it's a nice part of our Adventures in the Wildest Places series when, many of us are not getting to too many wild places now, but can help to check off some places where we want to go on our bucket list when we can again. So thanks everyone for being here. I'm going to pass it now over to Brian from North South Rivers.
Great, yeah, thanks Morgan, I appreciate that. My name is Brian with the North South Rivers Watershed Association, and we're really excited to be here on another week of our Winter Nature Challenge. And so we've been having a lot of fun so far, and we have had a lot of people register. We have close to 350 people signed up for this, so we're really excited that so many people are staying engaged with anything nature right now, even if it's virtual. So in addition to that, we have had several folks who have been sending in their challenges and pictures of challenges too, included right here. So from last week's challenge and presentation that Doug from Mass Audubon gave, here are 2 pictures, one by Rosemary and another by John. And one is of an immature herring gull with the quahog right there. And another is a snacking common eider there, which is both really cool to see that people are out. These are actually fantastic pictures, by the way. So we really appreciate that, and that people are actually going out and doing the challenge and being engaged in nature, and really taking in some of the information that Doug provided last week. So very cool. These are the winners of this week. All right. In addition to the program, we certainly, being several nonprofits here, any donations is always, definitely encouraged and very appreciated. Your support definitely helps us to continue to offer virtual and in programs like this. So you can see that we're at about a little over $420 right now, almost halfway to our goal. So throughout this program in the chat, I will post information on how you can click to donate to get to this page right here, or you can text to give as well. Both those links will be in the chat function. And although we are using the NSRWA website for the donations, all donations will be split evenly amongst all 3 organizations. So your support definitely helps and is absolutely appreciated. So thank you for that. So for this program, I'm really excited. We've had a lot of people inquiring about this program in particular. And so I would like to introduce Louise Beaudry from a former educator with the South Shore Natural Science Center, now an environmental educator and middle school science teacher, as well as Jonathan James Perry, the Aquino Wampanoag member, and Chris Jacobs, the executive director of the South Shore Natural Science Center. So I'd like to happily introduce these three people.
All right, sorry about that, everybody. I have a little bit of a glitchiness going on with my computer right now. So I want to, again, introduce myself. My name is Louise Beaudry. I am a middle school science teacher in northeastern Vermont. And I actually moved back up here about a year ago. I grew up, born and raised up here. And prior to that year ago, I actually was on the South Shore, where I worked as an environmental educator, a camp counselor, and more recently as the director of education at the South Shore Natural Science Center. So I'll be starting the lecture tonight. And, you know, I like to really start with a story. So as you can see, this is Reading the Landscape, a glacial story. Every good story starts with once upon a time. So I want to tell you a little bit about my childhood and my upbringing as a youngster. So, you know, going back about 35 years ago, when I was about 7 or 8 years old. And I was raised here in northeastern Vermont, pretty close to the Canadian border, just a few miles away. And I was raised by two very involved parents. My mom was an elementary school teacher and wanted to share the knowledge of the world around me, basically by looking in books, reading about it. My dad, on the other hand, was more of an experiential teacher. So he took us on a lot of adventures, a lot of experiences, did a lot of observations. I'm the oldest of 3 kids, and we were always out learning something. So back when I was younger, we did sort of our annual pilgrimage, and it was to what we called the Moss Rock. And the Moss Rock was a really magical place for me and my younger sister, and my father, for that matter. We would go there every single year. It was on our neighbor's property, but it was a little bit of a walk. So we would first pack up our lunch, have a picnic, take our picnic with us, go into the woods, and you know, we would walk for what seemed like hours to a 7 or 8-year-old, and we'd end up at this location, and it was such a special place for us. And to a 7 or 8-year-old, this Moss Rock was enormous. It was the size of a house, and it was covered in this beautiful green, soft, velvety moss. So I would climb up the side of this giant rock, and my dad would help my little sister get up to the top, and we'd sit up there and we would eat our picnic lunch and just lay there looking up at the tops of the trees, taking it all in, the views, the sounds, the smells. And my dad would tell me a story about how that rock came to be there in the woods. And he said something called a glacier brought it there. A really big piece of ice and snow is what he told us. And it wasn't until I was older that I really learned and came to appreciate what that rock really meant. And it's funny, I went back to that spot as an adult, and I took my younger siblings, as we were all adults, and we followed the directions that our father had told us and how to get there. We walked through the woods, and it only took about 25 minutes, not the several hours we thought it was going to take. And we got to that spot where the rock should have been, and we couldn't find the rock. We wonder, maybe my dad gave us the wrong directions. Had it really been that long since he had been there and forgotten? Or maybe the rock was a lot smaller than I thought and I overlooked it. Or perhaps it was just a really magical spot and you needed a little kid to be around in order to see it. So it was such a great glaciers. So I want to take you back in time a lot further back than when I was 7 or 8. And that time was a couple of million years ago when the last great ice age actually started to happen on this planet. There have been about 5 ice ages in the history of the Earth, and the most recent one started a couple of million years ago. But I really want to talk about that glacier and sort of the end of that glacial period. So throughout those times of the ice age, there were several glacial periods. We had glaciers come and go, but the most recent one was something that was here until about 20,000 years ago, and then it began to recede. So this picture shows a reconstruction of the furthest extent of where these ice, this glacier actually went to. So if you take a look, you'll see Massachusetts is kind of hiding under that lower section right here down in the bottom corner. Oh, sorry about that. And this covered most of what's now Canada and a good section of what's now northern United States. The terminal end of where this glacier ended up, at least in New England, was basically Cape Cod and the islands. So it covered the entire state and had a huge, huge impact on the story of our land. Come back to the giant rock. This is actually not a picture of our Moss Rock, but the largest known glacially transported boulder up in Maine. And you can take a look at this person standing down below as a bit of a scale reference. This place, I'm sure, is very special, very magical to someone else, but we call these giant rocks an erratic. It's Latin for wanderer. It's a perfect name for it because it's not a rock that just was moved from a little spot closer to that. It was actually from far away. So these rocks are things that didn't occur in these areas. They were carried by this massive sheet of ice and snow. So as it says, a glacially deposited rock that differs from the underlying bedrock. So it's not like anything else around it. So as these glaciers were forming during that ice age, the huge ice sheet, basically what happened is you ended up with massive, massive amounts of snow compacting itself higher and higher, sometimes 2 miles thick at its thickest spot. And that compression actually melted the lower layer and turned it into an ice skate, basically. And it gave this glacier the chance to move along, and it would go in a southeasterly direction down in Massachusetts, carrying big things like this glacial erratic we see here, and perhaps the Moss Rock from my childhood. Glacial till is another thing that might be transported by a glacier. So as you see, it's an unsorted mixture of finely crushed rock, sand, pebbles, cobbles, and boulders deposited by that glacier. This particular picture is actually from the Science Center, and it is a stone wall, a rock wall that was built from this glacial till that was left behind from that glacier. Another really interesting and really kind of cool thing that I love to look at as a clue from our time of the Ice Age is something called an esker. It's a very sinewy, snake-like formation, very narrow, and it's actually created by the meltwaters that come out of the glacier as it's retreating. So as that glacier started melting and going back towards the north, everything that was stuck in it, all the rocks and the sand, everything that was in there is being washed out, and a stream forms at the base of this glacier, and all those minerals, all those deposits come down and basically build up this long, thin hill. It's often winding through. There are a few really great examples of eskers right on the South Shore. This particular picture is of one of the most amazing eskers, Weymouth. It's a fantastic spot. You can go and park your car and go out on a walk. And you actually walk along the ridge of this Esker. And you'll notice from this picture that the slides are pretty steep, comes right down the side. And if you were to dig into that Esker, you would find that the sediment is actually layered. So thinking about how sediments and rocks and pebbles kind of layer out or fall to the bottom in a stream, same kind of thing happens. You have very sandy spots in there, you have very pebbly spots in there, and then larger rocks as well. It's such a great spot to take kids or just go for a great nature walk. Has a great spot for geocaching if that's something you're into, and I think that's another talk later in the series. Another spot is at the Jacobs Pond Conservation Area, and this is another great spot. It goes along the pond, along Jacobs Pond in Norwell, and kind of cuts out into the woods, and it does wind around quite a bit, and you feel like you're sort of having a magical spot again, walking along that ridge, and just gives you really a sense of the history of that land. I love looking at clues from the glacial period. I love thinking about the past, but also thinking about what the future and what this land will look like in another 1,000 years, another 1,000,000 years. A couple other things that happen that are more clues about what we see in southeastern Massachusetts in particular is the outwash, or an outwash plain. So the sand and the gravel that's deposited by the meltwater as that glacier is melting away, as it's receding. So basically like a river mouth, all this stuff is being pushed out and spread out. And this is really important because it builds up a lot of the land that we're very used to along the edge of the Cape and the southern ends of the islands, both Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. A moraine, on the other hand, is a landform of all the glacial till, all that stuff that's mixed up that was in that glacier and gets deposited in a ridge. So it's basically a wall of things that were in the glacier at its end, at its terminal spot. So you end up with much taller areas. And we'll look at a diagram and a map a little bit later in this, and you'll see that it kind of creates the bones of some of our land in southeastern Massachusetts. Here's an example of some of the moraines area. So as that glacier came down, the ice sheet marked in green here extended all the way down to where the islands are. And the outwash plain, everything that ran out of that spread out into what is now ocean, but it's still on the continental shelf. So it's deposited there. If you were to go down under the water, you would see the same type of debris down there, glacial debris, as you see along other edges of the Cape as well. And then in sort of pink color here is that terminal edge of that glacier. And that's where the moraine actually is. That is that buildup, that wall at the end of, as you see here, the 3 lobes. So looking at this area, you actually had 3 separate lobes of that glacier that kind of came together and deposited that glacial till. And actually, if you look on the left side of this diagram, you have sort of a peak at the top of the island, and it really is where these 2 lobes came together, which kind of made that peak, that sort of triangular shape. Another thing that you've probably heard of before, based on Mass Audubon has Drumlin Farm up in Lincoln. So a drumlin is an ice sculpted mound of glacial till. And this is basically as the glacier is moving, you can see the flow of the ice in the diagram on the right. It's moving down towards the south as it's heading that way in a southeasterly direction in this case. And sometimes the glacier kind of gets built up on something. There might be something that it's not able to slide along and kind of gets stuck. And as it does, it kind of captures a lot of those boulders, those larger rocks, and they are deposited at the base of this left side here. So it would be the northerly side of this drumlin. And once that starts to get stuck, other things get trapped on it, and more get trapped, and more get trapped, and it builds up this hill. And almost to me looks like the edge of an airplane wing. So you have a steeper side on one side and a much more gentler or gradual side on the other as it sort of glided over this mound of till that it's built up on itself. So you end up with this really kind of egg-shaped formation, and it makes up a lot of the locations that you probably drive by every day, or you might have gone and seen in a place like Boston Harbor. Boston Harbor Island is a perfect place to experience the Drumlin Formation. If you ever get a chance to go out to the islands, it's a fantastic place. As a camp counselor at the South Shore Natural Science Center, I took middle school kids out there for a camping trip. And it's such a wonderful place, such a gem in the area, and so many great things to look at, clues of the history of the land. Lots and lots of the inner islands are drumlins. And if we zoom into one in particular, one of my favorites, Pettix Island, which is right off the edge of Hull, it is built up by several drumlins. So on the left side of this diagram, you see just the map of Pettix Island. But on the right side, I've included the topography, the terrain. And you see up in the northeastern section of this, we actually have two large drumlins that make up the main part of the island. Then you have a sandbar that connects the others, and then a small drumlin down at the base, and then one out on the west side. And when you go there, you can stand along this area and see that kind of flat end where it kind of got stuck as it was moving along, and then that much more gradual, gentle slope on the other side. And part of those areas, although it's been a few years since I've been, part of those areas you can see the strata, you can see the different layers in the deposited glacial till in that drumlin. One other thing that is very common and very familiar to a lot of you, I'm sure, especially if you live in the Plymouth area, if you go to Miles Standish State Forest, this one in particular, Walden Pond, not on the South Shore, but a great spot as well, and certainly a famous area. A Kettle Pond is basically a hole that's been formed in the land, and it wasn't anything that really pushed the land down, but instead was a chunk of ice that fell off of the receding glacier as it was moving back towards the north. A massive chunk fell off. And looking at these kettle ponds, the size, the mass of this kettle pond is really the size, the dimensions of that chunk that broke off, just to give you a perspective on that. Huge, huge chunks dropping off of this glacier as it's receding. And it stayed there in the land as the glacier receded, but all that glacial till was still kind of emptying out of that glacier, be poured out, perhaps eventually forming an esker, but just coming out in that outwash plain. And that stuff surrounded this giant chunk of ice and snow, and sometimes even buried it. Later on, when the temperature warmed even more, those giant chunks of ice would melt. And now we have a hole, we have a depression in this glacial till. And if that hole is deep enough and it hits the water table or intersects the water table below under the ground, it will continue to hold water. And that's how we get our kettle ponds that we have so many of in the area. If it doesn't intersect that water table, it's just a depression in the land that you can see. And you might not even notice it. It may kind of blend in to the rest of the terrain. But if it hits the water table, you're definitely going to have water being held in that area. So kettle ponds are a fantastic spot to go visit. I highly recommend going to Walden Pond. Great place to swim, great place to hike, and certainly history with Thoreau's cabin there as well. Sort of to wrap up this intro of glaciation and the history of what the impacts of this glacier are on Massachusetts, a little bit more complex of a couple of diagrams here. So up on the upper left, you'll see the glaciers, the two lobes. So you can kind of picture this as what might have been down near Martha's Vineyard and parts of the Cape. And it shows you the tunnel and the lakes that form as it starts to melt. And that tunnel eventually will turn into an esker, this buildup of sediment that turns into a long winding hill. On the right side, you can see some of the effects of that receding glacier, some of the things we talked about already, the outwash, the eskers, the terminal moraine, where that buildup, that wall is where the lobe was ending of that ice sheet. You see the kettle ponds, you see the glacial till, you even see a delta, that lake that was there as it's kind of pouring out through the tunnel and into the lake. You have this beautiful delta that's formed. And it just transforms the ground, transforms what it looks like. In fact, it was such a massive sheet of ice, it literally pushed the bedrock further down. So the ground that we think of as the ground was further down at the time. It was pushed down, and then lots of things deposited on top as that glacier receded. And the last diagram in the center on the bottom really shows you where those moraines are, that wall that was left behind at the base of the glacier, at the terminal end. You can see sort of the bones of Cape Cod as it was formed in yellow there, and the bones of Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. And if you go to these places, you will notice that those bones, those moraine areas, are much higher in elevation, where the things below it, the southern parts of it, are much flatter. That would be the outwash area. So much flatter along the base of Cape Cod, as well as the southern parts of Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. You can really see it if you go to these places and just really think about the history and how all of that came to be. Such a fantastic view when you go down there. So just a couple of things that might help you to look into this a little bit more. I know that was a really quick overview. The picture on the left is just a fantastic book, The Roadside Geology of Massachusetts. There's a series that is out for most of the states, but The Roadside Geology of Massachusetts is by far one of the best. And it has fantastic information, both to teach you about what's happening and the rocks that form Massachusetts and glaciation and how that all happened, and certainly talking more than I did tonight about that. But also gives you some opportunities to go out and find some of these spots, make suggestions, as I did, about things that you can see to really view this in person. On the right is another book that I go to quite a bit. It's more of a kind of a textbook, but sort of a textbook for someone that wants to teach themselves about geology. And when you look in this book, it has tons of information, great pictures, great diagrams, ask questions to you to kind of think about as you're reading, and even has a few quiz questions at the end of each chapter to test your knowledge. A couple other spots you can go to online, the USGS, the Geological Survey, has fantastic information, both for the general public, certainly more scientific information on there. You can go look into topographic maps. There are even a couple places you can look at that have kids resources as well, which as a middle school science teacher is something I do a lot. National Park Service, also very knowledgeable, also has some great resources on their site. And then a little bit more locally is something that I was a part of when I lived in Massachusetts, is the Southeastern Massachusetts Mineral Club. Basically, it's a bunch of people like me that are kind of rock geeks and really like to talk about rocks and get together and show off, do a little show and tell on all the things that you collected. Just a fantastic organization, obviously not meeting together right now, but hopefully will soon. I believe they will be meeting at Bridgewater State University. So it's a great spot to go and check it out. Incredibly knowledgeable people that love to tell as many stories as I like to tell about this. I will leave you with this picture, which I was taking actually in Rhode Island on a vacation, and I collect a lot of rocks. My parents, I think, still have boxes of rocks at their house, and I haven't lived there in 20 years, but rocks like this on the beach, stacking rocks, certainly a beautiful way to meditate a little bit. And I do encourage you to put them back when you're done and not take the entire beach home. But I want to thank everybody for listening, and I'm honored to be a part of this wonderful lecture series, and so nice to reconnect to the South Shore Natural Science Center, a place I called home for for many, many years. I will pass it on to Jonathan, and we'll be taking questions at the very end. Thanks so much.
Cha Waninakan, Natasois Jonathan James Perry, Notomas Aquanahanat. Hello, my name is Jonathan, and I come from the Aquina community of the Wampanoag Nation located on Martha's Vineyard. I said Waninakan, which is good evening. I'm just going to share my screen now. So bear with me. So I come from an indigenous community that has existed on the coastline for a very, very long time. And you may have seen our tribal seal in your travels if anyone has traveled to Martha's Vineyard or has noticed any native gatherings sometimes in the region. You might see our tribal nation's seal or flag flown at those gatherings. But if you look closely, when you look at our tribal flag or our seal, you'll notice that there's a being holding a whale, and that being is Moshup. Moshup quite literally means great, great man or giant man. And we have a lot of stories about how Moshup was a leader of our people and guided our people and cared for us and did things for both his family and his family being, of course, our tribal nation, but his immediate family as well. This is the place that we refer to as home. This is Martha's Vineyard, a place we referred to as Nalpe, and we still call it that today. That's the traditional name for the place. And of course, someone came sailing along and noted it and said it was a beautiful place covered with grapes and waterways and delicious foods of various sorts and strong, tall, healthy people. And this person decided to name it after their daughter, Martha. However, we named it a long time prior to that. Nalpe, as you had seen in the geological tour that you have just witnessed. Thank you very much for the stories of the glacial activities and such. The island of Martha's Vineyard, sections of it were not covered by the most recent glacial activity. And it is said that our people witnessed the changing of the landscape. Moshup, the great giant, was said to have walked this area and guided our people to this place a long, long time ago. And it was said that when Moshup traveled, he traveled so far with our people that when we arrived, he had grown tired and he was literally carrying some of our people. And because of the distance and his size, and because he was taking the burden of some of the people on, it was said that Moshup dragged his toe. And in dragging his toe, he literally reft the earth, and where the earth was reft, the water washed in, and the islands became what they are known today. They were literally separated from the mainland by the footsteps and the movements of Moshup. This map here essentially shows some of the Wampanoag territory and places of the allied communities that made my tribal nation and what we consider our territory or our homelands today. The multiple ways of recognizing tribal nations' territory oftentimes will come from landscape features. So being cognizant of major rivers, hills, or even mountains for some tribal nations, bays and ponds and lakes and high hills and those sorts of features. Those were oftentimes demarcation areas to identify the boundaries of a community or a tribal nation. And so oftentimes we just worked with the natural features of the land because it was quite easy to be able to paddle by in your canoes or to hike along and walk on the pathways and roads and recognize when you were home versus when you were entering another nation, whether they were an allied nation, whether you were at war with that nation, or quite literally had very little truck or trade with the people of that place. Then perhaps a little bit of diplomacy interaction prior to crossing the landscape in those areas was necessary, as opposed to freely just walking comfortably through your own town or your own community. So our places, like the Aquina Cliffs, quite literally meaning the high point or the ending place of the island, were not only recognized for their beauty, but also recognized as those symbols of specific territories. Even whalers more recently always talked about being able to sail into the area, and as they headed towards the major whaling port of New Bedford, they would note that they would see the Gay Head Cliffs, as they used to be called and are still referred to today, as a sign that they were coming home. So similarly, other features all up and down the coastline were utilized by folks at sea. And of course, my ancestors, people, have used various vessels, including, of course, huge dugout canoes that we created from 60-foot, 70-foot long, large old growth logs from these enormous trees. And we would make these vessels that held 40 paddlers, men, women, leaders, you name it. They would be on these sailing vessels and traveling the coastline. And of course, it's very important to have one good idea of direction, to be able to navigate both by the stars and to be able to navigate by the sun, and to have sharp eyes to be able to track your coastline. And also, like Polynesian people and many other cultures on Earth, to be able to read the water and the movement, the waves, and to be able to quite honestly mark where you are on the map based on what the water is doing around you. If you are deep in the ocean and you can't see the land and you do not know how to navigate by stars and by the various signs around you, including being able to pick up the smell of plants or smoke or various things from the coastline, from the various native villages or towns, even today, and you're quite honestly dangerous. There are many things around us that would also be acknowledged and seen as important. Balanced boulders, as you learned about, had to do with the glacial movements. Some of them were altered by my ancestors and utilized for various purposes, ceremonial spaces and markers for territories or pathways or certain historical events. And so they were oftentimes celebrated and they were important. Some of these places that our folks visited on a regular basis were turned into teaching tools. So for instance, here is Dighton Rock. And Dighton Rock is what similar to a lot of other stones that were carved and on them set petroglyphs. They're referred to in our culture as talking stones. And these were teaching or gathering spaces where various generations would come together and share stories or knowledge. They could have, for instance, stories of the stars and the star stories, because as I said, you have to be able to navigate when you're at sea. You also have to be able to kind of place yourself in the night sky when you're walking or traveling away from home. So it's very important for our people to have these teaching places and these ceremonial places where the knowledge that had been carried for generations upon generations could be passed on. One of the important things about oral cultures and societies like ours is that we maintain an unending chain of knowledge, and every generation that is born is to carry that knowledge forward and add to it. So in some societies, for instance, like the Anishinaabe people, for instance, and there are relatives, they quite literally in their name, it's stated they are the perfect creation. And that perfect creation concept is that every time someone has a child, that is the perfect creation, because this is a being that is connected to and sort of the pinnacle of all the generations prior coming together in one being. And so this vessel carries with them not only that connection to many, many minds and many points of knowledge, but is also able to advance all of the gifts of knowledge that they get from their community and from their own family and their experiences, and take it further. So the idea is to always march your knowledge a step further, to add to it and to grow. And so the next generation and the generation after is supposed to outdo you, is supposed to outgrow you, is supposed to become more important than you. And that is one of the ways that we celebrated the future generations, and we celebrated life, always thinking for them and thinking of growth and movement forward, and not really thinking about ourselves as the ultimate or the most important. So these teaching spaces are vitally important for our people, for Indigenous people, for Wampanoag people specifically, because that is the nation I hail from. It is most important for us to understand the landscape around us, to understand the plants and what they do, what type of ground they grow in, and how they're growing. And sometimes even understanding how nutrient rich the soil that space has, that how rich that soil is, will impact how strong certain plants are, whether it's plants for harvesting for feeding your family, or whether it's plants that you're making medicines from to heal and take care of your sick or your elderly or people with issues. And so understanding what the land is providing and understanding the quality of the soil, the quality of the water, um, the strength of that space is very important if you're going to live for any period of time and be healthy and be able to provide all the needs for your people. So the knowledge of reading the land, reading the plants, reading the weather, reading the water, that was all a major part of our education system, and it still is. If anyone talks to fishermen who spend a lot of time on the water, they understand that they need to be able to read the wind and the weather and read the waves, because if you're not careful, the ocean can take you. So it demands that level of respect. We're oftentimes very comfortable today because we have many things around us to kind of read our spaces for us so that we become sort of complacent about it, to the point that now someone might be walking in the woods and not have an idea of north, south, east, or west, and not be able to read all the signs around them to tell them that that information that could save their life or make their day less stressful. And so we pull out a compass, or now you might have it on your Android phone or your iPhone, right? And kind of get an idea of your bearings. But really, honestly, that was not the case for many thousands of years. So when my ancestors watched the glaciers retreat, and they watched the landscape change, and they watched the ocean levels rise, and had to relocate villages and change our lifestyle, the important things that would tell you what to do and how to do it, and where to do it, those were all slowly revealed or changed, and that knowledge had to be imparted to the next generation. And so we built on it and built on it. When my ancestors would paddle along the coastline, they would note, like I said, the places like Aquina. We have in our stories, we talk about Moshup having a wife, and his wife's name was Squant. And a long, long time ago, when Moshup and his children decided to journey and leave the area, essentially um, for the understanding that things would change even further and trying times were coming, Moshup took his children and tossed them into the sea, and they became killer whales. And then Moshup picked up his wife and tossed her to the mainland, and she landed in Sakonnet on the coast there. And that Squant Rock today, it was said that she reclined and became stone and forever watched her children of the sea. So when our people would paddle the coastline heading towards the Rhode Island waters and the Rhode Island end of our tribal nation's territories, they would pass Squant Rock, and they would give gifts and say thank yous for Squant, who watched her children of the sea, our people, right? So all these devices around us, whether they were the landscape feeding us and healing us, or caring for us in various ways, whether it was formations on the coast and features on the coast that guided us, the stars, the wind, the water, everything in our nation, everything in our territory was constantly teaching us and telling us how to be. And it was important for our elders to teach us how to interpret all of that information. It was important for each of the next generation to listen and maintain that knowledge, and to take up the charge of educating their children and their grandchildren, and so on and so forth. So that unending chain has managed to make us a very advanced, very successful people on this earth, and allowed us to still maintain a good sense of ourselves today as modern Indigenous people here, despite all the challenges that we've faced, whether it be slavery, unfortunately, which is very much a part of our history in recent years, or wars, or sicknesses, and all the various things that challenged us. We still have had that unending chain, so that when you go into my community in Aquina, we still are doing our Masha, Legends of Masha, our plays, essentially acting out our traditional stories, talking about the megafauna, talking about the ocean and the changes, and how our people became established in this area many, many, many thousands of years ago. And we will continue that on and on for as long as we possibly can as Indigenous people, because we share this space. We quite literally are in the water, in the earth, We are related to the stones here. We are in the trees here. We still walk on the land here. We still do ceremonies, and we intend to be here forever. So I want to say Katapatash, Katapatanamu. Thank you all for listening to me for a short bit. And I want to say thank you to Chris Jacobs and the South Shore Science Center. I appreciate you all.
Thanks, Jonathan. And we really appreciate, we always love listening to you and just hearing about your history and your people's history. And it's just great to learn so much about that. So with that, I'm just going to go ahead and just pick up where we left off. All right. So we're kind of going historically here. Louise started with the glaciers, and then Jonathan picked up from there and the importance of reading the landscape. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about reading the landscape from the last about 300 years. So this is Assinippi. We kind of know this area now as Assinippi Corner. And what I learned is that Assinippi and Wampanoag is rocks and water or rocky water. And this is Jacob's Pond, which is was also known originally as Snappit Pond. And then after the establishment of the Jacobs farm and the Jacobs farmhouse, it eventually became renamed as Jacobs Pond. So unlike the Kettle Ponds that Louise talked about earlier, this is actually a man-made pond. Now it wasn't dug out, but it was dammed up. And when it was dammed up at 3rd Herring Brook and Main Street, it filled in with water, and then it was dammed up to build a mill. And it was created in 1723. And here are some pictures. And if you look today, this is actually Main Street or 123 here. This is the cemetery. And then over here as well, this is Main Street with the pond on the other side or vice versa. So this Jacob's Mill, they thought this painting probably came from a French painter. And one of the things that they would do is in exchange for room and board, they would paint the business or the house that they were staying at. And that was kind of their pay, their keep in exchange for that room and board. So as we said, it means rocky water. And here are one of the rocks in Jacob's Pond. And if you've ever kayaked or canoed in Jacob's Pond, it is actually very, very shallow. It's about 4.5, 5 feet deep. And here's the rock with some really neat birds. We have a great blue heron. Here's a common loon, and then a belted kingfisher. And these photos were thanks to John Galuzzo. He's down there quite often, and he's taking lots and lots of photos. So slowly, Jacob's Pond is filling in. New plants and animals adapted to drier conditions will replace the aquatic forms. Ultimately, the pond will become only a memory to those who once passed by unless dramatic steps such as dredging are taken. And so for those who have spent a lot of time at Jacob's Pond over the last 30, 40, 50 years, you can definitely see some of that happening. I've been with the Science Center since 1996. And you can see all that. You can see the difference. We see more aquatic plants that are and invasive plants that are taking over some of that water. But basically what is happening is succession, and eventually Jacob's Pond will fill in. So what is succession? Succession is essentially when new plants take over and new plants move in. And so we have some pictures here of one of my favorite topics, which is a wolf tree. And a wolf tree are these big, gigantic trees in the middle of woods or in the middle of fields. And as you can see here around them, they have much, much smaller trees. Now, wolf trees, when the settlers first arrive, most of eastern United States was forested. But the European settlers, what they were familiar were with pastoral lands and agriculture. And so slowly as they began to settle, they brought livestock over, which grazed. They started building. They needed wood to heat. They needed to clear the land to create those pastures. And in fact, at one point, 80% of Massachusetts had been cleared for farming. And then as the Industrial Revolution came along, these farmlands were left alone. And eventually what happened is that new seeds, those seeds that were in the soils, and as birds and animals traveled through depositing seeds, and more plants and trees started to form and grow. But what were left behind were these wolf trees, these gigantic trees that had been left by the settlers for one reason or the other. Big oaks and maples and pine trees, some of them 150, 200, 300 years old. And what's very distinctive about a wolf tree are these lower branches, because there isn't any competition and they can get light at those lower levels of those branches, so they would grow out. And so a very distinct feature of the wolf trees are these big branching lower branches. One of my favorite things to do with kids here in this middle picture is just see how many arms it takes to hug a wolf tree. And so here we are. This is actually one of our walks from the Winter Nature Challenge, and we were putting our arms around, and usually it takes for this tree on the Science Center property here, it usually takes about 3 or 4 arms, adult arms, to wrap around that tree. So there was a time where about 100 years ago, wolf trees were thought to be a nuisance, and they weren't any good for lumber, and a lot of them are sometimes rotten and starting to decay in the middle. But the thought process started to change, because ultimately these wolf trees are actually an amazing ecological habitat for so many different animals, from insects and birds and owls and raccoons and squirrels and so many different species that we'll call a single wolf tree home. And George Eliot said, about 70 years ago, "I take the stand as a character witness to wolf trees. These dead, dying, and decaying trees are the most interesting places in the forest." So those are wolf trees, and a definite sign of succession. Another sign, and here is an example of succession, and you can see here, here is an old field that has been left. And if you are familiar with Willowbrook Farm, it is an excellent spot to see succession, to see the agricultural roots of that farmland, and what happens when farmland is just left. And so this is what we would call an old field. And then here to the right, this is more of a marsh area, and a swamp, actually, I should say. And the same thing, a swamp will eventually become woods and forest as that decaying matter, all that detritus from the trees, the falling leaves starts to build the soil, and eventually it'll become forest again. So that leads us to stone walls. Louise talked about all the glacial till all these rocks that were that are here left over from the glaciers. But what is interesting is that when the settlers first started clearing land, that's not when stone walls actually came to be, because a lot of these rocks were down in the ground. But it was as we deforested Massachusetts that eventually those rocks started to rise. So in the beginning, the boundaries were built out of zigzagged wooden fences. And there actually used to be someone called a fence viewer, and it was a position within the government, and that fence viewer would go through, and he or she would, well, he at that time would essentially settle debates. And it was first established in the late 1690s, and there are still fence viewers within towns today. And so I just thought that was a really great tidbit. And so it wasn't until later, until the 17 and 1800s, that these stone walls started to pop about and pop up. And a lot of times they were actually, the stones were brought in from other areas, not always right from where the stone walls are. They were brought from caves and from slopes and areas like that. Now, obviously, as they farmed the land and those rocks rose to the surface, we hear that term a lot, that, in New England, we grow rocks, because again, eventually they move their way up to the surface and they would be brought to the edges. And sometimes they were used for boundaries, and sometimes they were used for keeping livestock in. So there were different types of stone walls based on the purpose of what they needed them for. All right. Another thing that you might see that is a remnant of the agricultural land, and that this was once cleared, are something called borrow pits. And this is actually a photo from the Science Center. And it is basically, the word borrow pit came from the land and soil, and that glacial till was being borrowed to be used for something else. And oftentimes they were borrowed for making roads and highway, and especially as Route 3 came into play. So you'll see these depressions in the grounds, and sometimes the depression will sometimes fill with water even. In this particular one at the Science Center doesn't, but then sometimes you'll get borrow ponds, they've been called. And sometimes, depending on what the depression is like, it might create something called a vernal pool. So vernal pools are bodies of water or wetlands that fill up in the springtime. They're in low-lying areas, and all the rain and the melting snow will fill up these depressions. And here you can see one in early spring, and then one a little bit later. You can see it starting to dry out, and then here's one in winter. These two are of the same vernal pool. The one's on the left and the one on the right is right here at the Science Center. These two are off of, this one here is off of Grove Street in Norwell. But again, as the snow melts, it's going to fill up with water. And these are important because there are very specific species of animals that depend on these vernal pools for survival. And one of them is called the fairy shrimp. And at this particular pool in Norwell on the left-hand side, we found evidence of these fairy shrimp, and that's actually where that picture came from. Fairy shrimp are really neat, tiny little crustaceans that are cousins to shrimp and lobster. If you ever grew up with sea monkeys, these are exactly what sea monkeys are. Their eggs can lay dormant for years, and then when they their eggs are met with water, essentially they can begin to develop. So if you find fairy shrimp in a closed body of water like this vernal pool, that is evidence that it is a vernal pool. These are called obligate species. They only lay their eggs in vernal pools. Another one is a spotted salamander. Spotted salamanders are also obligate species. And if you've ever heard of Big Night, where the first rain in the spring, you might see a congress of salamander coming to the vernal pools, where the males will lay their sperm, and then the females will come and pick up their sperm. And then we have the wood frog. This is another obligate species. And so if you find evidence of any of these species, you can actually go through a really neat citizen science project to certify your vernal pools, which then in turn helps protect them. So just another type of depression that you might not notice or you might not give a lot of thought to, but they're really important. And unfortunately, until recently, last 50 years or so, in the summertime, they look like just a dip in the land when it's all dried up. And so they were often filled in and built upon. But those lots of new rules and regulations and laws protecting vernal pools have come into play. So that's great. So we just want to quickly wrap up, but there are some great places to view agriculture on the South Shore, remnants of agriculture on the South Shore. There's so much history in this area, but here's just a few. We have Bay Farm, the Willowbrook Farm, which is one of my absolute favorites, World's End, Daniel Webster, and then of course the Jacobs Pond Conservation Area. And the Science Center itself, it's all left over. We can actually see furrows from the old cornfields at Jacobs Farm. So, all right. So we have a challenge this coming week in regards to reading the landscape. And so while out exploring, take a picture of glacial or agricultural evidence. Research the native traditional name for the town or community where you reside. What does it mean or refer to? Like Assinippi means rocky water. And then search for what could possibly be a vernal pool. Take a picture of the depression, and then I challenge you to keep an eye on that area and take a dip net and see if you can find any evidence of those fairy shrimp or eggs from the spotted salamanders or wood frog tadpoles. And so send your pictures or comments to ssnsc@ssymca.org. So now we're going to open it up for questions. And if you have a specific question for either Louise, Jonathan, or myself, just direct it to us directly. All right.
Yeah, Chris, I'm not seeing any questions. Usually I'll get a few sent in, emailed to me after the programs when people start watching them on YouTube. So I'll be sure to forward that.
Okay. We do have it looks like a couple of participants raised their hand. Deborah and Rosemary, your hands are raised, but if you could actually type your question into the chat function, that would be great if you have any questions. Oops. All right. Well, Brian, do you want to talk about this week's walk?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks, Chris. Yeah. As part of the this week's Winter Nature Challenge, we are going to be offering an outdoor guided activity that is totally optional, and you will be sent the registration for this if you would like to register for it. So this will be about reading the landscapes, and we'll be covering a lot of the top about today. It'll be led by Chris and myself, and it will be Monday, this coming Monday, February 15th from 10 to 12. And if you are like many of us who have been waiting for enough snow to go snowshoeing, this is the time. So we will have snowshoes available. Just please let us know when you register if you have snowshoes or not, because Chris in the Science Center would be happy to provide them for you. So limited space. We are going to be, of course, very safe and have a very small group for this guided event, but you will be sent a registration link just like usual after the webinar is over. All registrants will be given a opportunity to register for this. It is first come, first serve, so if you are interested, as soon as you see that link, just go ahead and register for it to reserve your spot. This outdoor event is being offered only to those of you who have registered for this talk. So, it will be a lot of fun. Be ready, because we're going to try to go maybe like the 2-mile loop through the Jacobs Pond Conservation Area. So meeting will be at the parking lot of Jacobs Pond. You will probably see the North-South River Watershed Subaru there, and I'm pretty sure you're going to see the Science Center van as well. So 2 very colorful vehicles. The parking area is, I think it's roughly around like 48. It's across the street from the entrance of the Science Center. So like 4850 Jacobs Lane in Norwell. And be there a little early so we can get those shoes on and get going and go for the first snowshoe, at least for me, in about 10 years. So if you're interested in that, and we have a lot of really cool things to talk about, a lot of great things to see there, the conservation land, if you've never been there before. So registration link will be coming up shortly.
All right, and then next week, Doug Lowry will be here from Mass Audubon, and he is going to go over In Search of Strigiforms, which is the order that owls are in. So if you came to beginner bird watching and you thought, it sounds like a little early for me, Doug, to get out there when the birds are out, and you're more of a night owl, literally, he will go over life history, the owls that you can find in Massachusetts, how to ethically search for them, and give you an inside look into the lives of these amazing birds. And also I'll say my background is actually from Marsh Wildlife Sanctuary, so a little further down on the South Shore, but a former cranberry farm up until 2015, and the area right behind me used to be full cranberry fields, and we just finished up a big restoration and that parking lot's open, so that's another place to go and look for signs of former agricultural history.
Great, thanks so much, Morgan. Awesome. Well, I just want to again say thank you so much to Louise. It's great having you teach with us again, and Jonathan, we love having you always. And so again, this Saturday, Jonathan and his wife Leah will be doing a program on pinch pots and raising an Indigenous family. And then in March, they're going to actually be doing a virtual maple cooking and maple sugaring demonstration. So look for that on Saturday, March 13th, and we're very excited for that program as well. So thank you all, and we will see you next week. And don't forget to send in your challenge and to sign up for the snowshoe hike on Monday. And I hear we might be getting some more snow. So thank you all.